A slave ship. One eyewitness to the trade described the ship's deck so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. Such ghastly scenes were common on the transatlantic ships during the height of the slave trade. From the 17th through the early 19th centuries, European and American vessels crisscrossed the Atlantic with human cargo, forging the brutal Middle Passage that carried Africans into the New World. Today, we're going to take a look at the experience of what the enslaved people went through aboard these ships, and we're going to do it in unflinching detail. Where do we get our information? First-hand narratives, ship logs, primary sources. You'll hear it from the people themselves. Our scope is broad and global. The captives came from many regions of Africa, destined to plantations on Brazil, the Caribbean, North America, and beyond. But the one thing they have in common was that the conditions they endured on the voyage were universally horrific. And so, by grounding today's account in the primary sources and eyewitness testimony, we're going to reconstruct how horrifying this journey was. One of unimaginable suffering, and if you were lucky, survival. Let me welcome you to the channel. If you're a newcomer, it's good to meet you. And those who have not yet done so, I invite you to click the subscribe button, which is conveniently right next to the like button. And thank you for those supporting on the Patreon and the merch store. Now, with all that out the way, let's get nice and relaxed, and we may begin. It's going to be a bit of a uncomfortable video, so you may as well relax now. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade, roughly the 1700s, slave ships became a conveyor between continents. Over 12 million Africans were forced onto about 35,000 slave voyages across the Atlantic. By the 1780s, the peak of this traffic, tens of thousands of Africans were sent across the ocean every year to meet the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in the New World. These voyages were all part of a profitable triangular network linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Multiple European colonial powers were involved, including the Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, and Dutch, and each dispatched ships to West and Central Africa to purchase slaves. Enslaved Africans from diverse regions such as Senegambia, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa all found themselves chained up, first in the markets, then in the holds of the ships. Most would be taken to labor on sugar, coffee, and cotton plantations in the Americas. The largest share were delivered to Portuguese Brazil, millions more to British and French colonies in the Caribbean, and a smaller number to North America. For the captives, the Middle Passage was but one stage of a much longer ordeal. Many had already survived violent capture, coffles marching them to the coast, and imprisonment in slave pens or forts, before they even saw any white man from overseas or any ship come to purchase them. Historians estimate that out of every 100 people seized in Africa, only about 57 of them made it onto a slave ship, and merely 48 survived to be sold in the Americas. Now this means that over half of those captured perished from the point of capture through to the transatlantic crossing. Most of them didn't even get out of Africa. The Middle Passage itself accounted for 1 million or more deaths. Yet those who did survive the voyage, that didn't mean the suffering was over. Far from it. It was time to get to work. Primary accounts by formerly enslaved Africans offer a rare insight into the moment they were forced aboard a slave ship. One such account comes from Oluwada Equiano, who was about 11 years old when he was kidnapped from his Igbo community in today's Nigeria and sold to European slavers around 1756. Equiano describes his first sight of the Atlantic Ocean and the slave ship waiting for him at anchor, filling him with terror. When he was brought on deck, the crew immediately handled and tossed him to inspect his fitness, much as one would examine livestock. He recalls that the white man's complexions, hair, and language were utterly alien to him, and he feared he encountered a world of bad spirits who intended to kill and eat him. This fear was not uncommon. Many African captives, having never seen Europeans before, believed the slavers to be cannibals. Equiano notes that when he saw a large cooking furnace on deck and the chained Africans around him in despair, that he no longer doubted his fate and fainted from horror. Upon arrival, Equiano was so overwhelmed that he wished for death rather than to know the terrors ahead. He was soon forced down into the ship's hold, where a horrifying new assault on his senses began. He writes, "I was soon put down under the decks, and there I received such salutation in my nostrils as I have never experienced in my life. The stench below deck was overpowering, a foul mix of sweat, vomit, urine, and feces that nearly suffocated him. Equiano became seasick. He refused to eat until the crew members intervened. He describes how when he initially refused food, one man grabbed his hands while another tried to force feed him, an ordeal that threw him into consternation." This foreshadows a common experience. Enslaved people who lost the will to eat were often forcibly fed by the crew, sometimes using a device called the speculum oris to pry their mouths open. Such was the captive's introduction to life aboard the slave ship, one of fear, sensory torment, and immediate violence to enforce compliance. Once the ship was set sail with its cargo, those in the hold faced an environment designed for profit, not for comfort. Slave ships were typically overcrowded to a nightmarish extreme. Men were chained together in pairs and packed spoon-fashioned in rows beneath the decks, with scarcely room to turn themselves. Women and children, though sometimes given slightly more space than allowed on deck, were also crowded into tight quarters. A schematic of the British slave ship Brooks, 1788, famously showed over 480 people arranged in a hold, only about 5 feet high, illustrating the practice of tight packing. Traders calculated that packing more people could offset the high mortality rates. Others argued for looser packing, in hopes that more captives would survive to sail. Either way, conditions were unbearable. One ship surgeon, Alexander Falconbridge, observed that enslaved people were often packed so close that it was impossible to sit or stand upright, and that they lay in a tangled mess of bodies and filth. The air quality below deck rapidly became pestilential once the ship was fully loaded. Equiano noted that when all the captives were combined together, the combined heat of the climate and the crowded humanity almost suffocated them. With inadequate ventilation, the atmosphere turned foul and poor of oxygen. The hold reeked of human waste and decay. Equiano accounts that the loathsome smells made the air unfit to breathe and caused widespread sickness among the slaves. The closeness and filth were aggravated by the galling of chains and the captives' limbs, the overflowing of toilet buckets. Children sometimes fell into these little buckets and nearly suffocated in excrement. The combination of heat, lack of sanitation, and stress created a breeding ground for disease. Deadly epidemics of dysentery, smallpox, measles, and fevers swept through the packed ranks. Captains like Thomas Phillips of the Hannibal tried to curb dysentery by feeding captives fiber-rich food, cornmeal, palm oil, pepper, and beans, and providing them citrus fruit. But such measures were meager against rampant illness. On the 1693 voyage of Phillips, 47% of the 700 enslaved Africans died, despite all his efforts. The living lay chained amidst the dying and dead. Equiano described how the shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying filled the gloom, creating a scene of horror almost inconceivable. Disease and despair claimed victims daily. Those who expired from sickness or injuries were unshackled and dumped overboard without ceremony. Sharks often trailed behind slave ships, well accustomed to feeding on the corpses jettisoned at sea. Such macabre details were noted by many observers. The odor of a slave ship was said to carry for miles on the wind, sometimes alerting other vessels, not by sight but by smell. For week after miserable week, the captives were effectively lost at sea, stranded in horrific conditions, not knowing where they were, subject to a regime meant only to keep them alive and subdued until landfall. A stew of human misery and terror. Life aboard a slave ship followed a strict and brutal regimen intended for maximum control over the captives, and to keep them alive, just enough to sell at the journey's end. Each day typically began with the crew doling out meager rations of food and water. Enslaved Africans were usually fed twice a day, often some sort of boiled beans or cornmeal, sometimes supplemented with rice, yams, or a bit of dried meat. This was typically cooked in a large copper pot on deck. Water was severely rationed. An enslaved person might receive about 1 liter of water a day. As Captain Phillips recorded, even these sparse meals could be life-saving. Slavers knew that starved captives would fetch low prices or just not survive at all. However, many captives were too sick or heart-sick to eat anyway. Refusal to eat was common, whether out of protest or extreme despair. A term for it was fixed melancholy. The crew responded by whipping those who would not eat, or using instruments previously described to force-feed them. One slave ship captain admitted to using the speculum oris to pry open the jaws of captives who tried to starve themselves. It was a cruel practice, aimed at preserving the captain's profit, even at the cost of torturing people determined to die rather than live. After the morning rations, the crew would undertake their version of cleaning the hold. This often meant having enslaved people scrape and swab the decks, while still in chains, to remove some of the accumulated filth. Sand or vinegar might be sprinkled and scrubbed across blood or waste-stained planks. Yet, the deep foulness could never truly be cleansed during the voyage. The slave deck remained a hellish, filth-strewn place throughout. To avoid the worst build-up, some captains forced captives to use the necessary buckets on a schedule and had crewmen empty them frequently. But in rough weather or at night, the enslaved were sometimes not allowed above to relieve themselves at all, causing them to soil the cramped space. One more of the bizarre daily rituals on some ships was called dancing the slaves, a euphemism for forced exercise. Captains believed that making captives move would keep their muscles strong and perhaps lift their spirits enough to prevent mass death from despair. As a 1729 slave ship medical guide advised, the health of the voyage depended on dealing kindly with Africans, and often diverting them with the drum, dance, etc., in order to dissipate the sorrowful thoughts of quitting their own country. In practice, this dance was enforced by the whip. Each day, when weather allowed, small groups of shackled men were brought up to the main deck. Sailors armed with cat-o'-nine tails, a multi-lashed whip, or ropes would compel them to jump and stomp in whatever space they had, sometimes to the rhythm of a drum or fiddle. Those who refused to dance or were too weak were often flogged until they either complied or collapsed. Captors also encouraged the enslaved to sing during these exercises, though if they grew irritated, if the Africans sang mournful, defiant songs, the beatings would continue. They must appear cheerful. Cruel punishments were a constant of the slave ship regime. Any perceived defiance, not eating, not exercising, attempting to rest, could result in a lashing or any other form of abuse. Enslaved Africans were whipped with such frequency that many bore scars by journey's end, and some were even beaten to death as an example to others. Discipline aboard was maintained by terror. The enslaved were usually kept in chains and watched by armed guards at all times. Captains often had special manacles, leg irons, collars, and shackles made for the voyage. Men were chained in pairs, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle. Women were typically left unshackled but still confined below or kept under surveillance on deck. At night, gratings over the hatchways were locked to prevent anyone from coming up. Many ships also strung netting along the deck rails to make it harder for captives to leap into the sea. Some vessels even repositioned cannons to command the slave deck. Phillips, for instance, placed 2 of the Hannibal's guns pointing down through the hatch, ready to blast grape shot into the hold in case of an uprising. The crew had a cache of weapons at hand: muskets, pistols, cutlasses, sometimes even grenades. Captains and sailors regarded the Africans as potential threats as much as cargo. Indeed, as Phillips wrote, some captives were experienced warriors capable of plotting to take over the ship. The crew always remained alert and ruthless in preempting rebellion. Essentially, it was a floating prison camp under martial law. Amid this routine of controlled brutality, there were occasional attempts at rudimentary care or pragmatism. Occasional, that is. If individuals felt deathly ill, they might be brought on deck for fresh air or segregated to prevent contagion. For instance, smallpox victims were sometimes quarantined in a makeshift infirmary area. Equiano, being a child and gravely sick, was kept mostly on deck and spared constant chaining, which, happily, perhaps saved him from the fate of the adults below. Ship surgeons applied basic treatments, cleaning sores, bleeding fevers, giving doses of lime juice to prevent scurvy, mainly to protect the captain's investment. Any recovery was counted a gain. Those who died were written off. The crew's underlying attitude remained mercenary. As long as a captive could survive to be sold, he or she would be sustained, however minimally. The moment a captive was deemed a lost cause, irrevocably ill or injured, they may be summarily discarded to save food and space. Throughout the passage, the captives themselves sought ways to cope with the trauma. Some found strength in songs, prayers, or quiet solidarity. Officers' journals occasionally noted the enslaved people singing at night, often mournful lamentations that carried in the dark. Such songs likely allowed them to mourn together and preserve a piece of their cultural identity amid the chaos. When possible, those who shared a language or region tried to console each other and care for the more vulnerable. Mothers comforted children. Ship logs mention African women assisting ailing shipmates. These human gestures persisted, despite the dehumanized environment. Still, every act of camaraderie took place under the watchful eyes of the guards, quick to quash anything they feared might lead to collective action. While the male captives endured the harshest physical constraints, women and children aboard the ships faced their own set of horrors. Women were typically not chained in the hold and were allowed a degree of mobility on deck compared to men. Captains assumed women were less likely to foment rebellion. However, this relative freedom made women extremely vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Contemporary witnesses, including ship surgeons and enslaved survivors, confirmed that assault of African women by sailors was commonplace. Enslaved women and girls, seen as property, had no recourse against the advances of crewmen. Officers sometimes explicitly selected a woman as a concubine for the voyage. One account by a ship's doctor described how crew members would drag women screeching from below at night. The victims of such assaults were left traumatized, and if they resisted, they could be beaten or even killed with impunity. There were no laws or ship rules to protect them. They were treated simply as another spoil of the trade. But despite these dangers, they could also play their roles in resistance. We'll see it in the next section. They sometimes used their relative freedom to communicate between the groups of male captives, or to make small makeshift weapons or tools that men could use in a revolt. Women also had to maintain whatever care they could for the children present. Children, of course, were generally not shackled, and those old enough to walk might move around the ship freely during the day. Crew members often viewed African children with a mix of amusement and indifference. They were less valuable cargo. Very young children might sell for lower prices, but they also posed no threat. Older enslaved children sometimes assisted the crew with minor tasks, perhaps to earn small favors or food morsels. Younger children clung to their mothers or other adults. Mothers did their best to soothe the crying infants amid the foul conditions. Some women even risked punishment to obtain a bit of extra food or water for their little ones. And even tragically, some enslaved women were forced to give birth during the voyage. In such instances, both mother and newborn were in grave danger due to the lack of medical care and the unsanitary environment. One famous formerly enslaved man, Ignatius Sancho, was born on a slave ship in 1729. His mother died soon after giving birth. His father, in despair, chose to take his own life. This was not an isolated case. Ship logs occasionally recorded stillbirths or infants born at sea who lived only a short time. If a mother died in childbirth, the crew might throw her infant overboard alive, rather than spare resources on an infant unlikely to survive. Such cruel actions underscore the utter commodification of those on board. The psychological torment for women was acute. They had witnessed their villages attacked, their families torn apart. Now at sea, they endured both the general misery of the hold and the personal terror of exploitation. Some women found ways to fight back. There are accounts of enslaved women attacking predatory sailors, scratching, biting, even stabbing them with utensils, though such resistance was usually met with lethal retaliation from the crew. Yet it sometimes took other forms. They might encourage men to revolt, or conceal plans from the inquisitive crew. In a few recorded instances, women committed infanticide or took their own life as an act of defiance. For example, mothers who smothered their infants or jumped overboard with children rather than let them live as slaves. Each woman's experience was unique, but collectively, enslaved women had to endure a burdensome dual role, victims of the same brutal regime of the men, and the additional victims of violence and family devastation. And so, faced with relentless cruelty, the enslaved Africans did not uniformly submit. Many resisted in whatever ways they could, ranging from quiet defiance to all-out rebellion. Despair, however, was pervasive. Some captives sought to simply take their own lives instead, and many did. In the terminology of the time, crews reported individuals dying of melancholy, essentially severe depression, leading to the loss of will to live. Some captives simply refused to eat until they wasted away, despite beatings and force-feeding attempts. Others attempted more direct ends to their suffering. There were numerous cases of Africans jumping overboard to drown. Equiano recounts how two of his fellow captives chained together managed to slip through the netting and leap into the sea. How they, quote, preferred death to such a life of misery. A third man, unshackled due to illness, followed them overboard. The crew sprang into action, stopping the ship and launching a small boat. But at least two of the three escapees drowned before they could be recovered. Enslaved people understood that the ocean offered an escape from torment. Some even believed that their souls would return to Africa if they died at sea. To deter such incidences, crews put up nettings and barriers and kept close watch. Yet the desperate captives still found their opportunities where they could. On some voyages, multiple people jumped to their deaths. In one notorious incident in 1776, a group of enslaved men deliberately drowned themselves by leaping from a ship off Jamaica, refusing to accept their fate as slaves. Contemporaries noted that these attempts were thousands in number over the centuries of the trade. Beyond individual acts, enslaved Africans regularly plotted revolts aboard slave ships. Shipboard revolts were especially common while the vessel was still near to the African coast, as captives saw a chance to ally with others on shore or swim to land. Over time, shipbuilders and captains modified vessels specifically to thwart rebellion, with reinforced hatch gratings, barricades, and weapons at the ready. The crew were constantly on guard. Any hint of uprising would prompt brutal, preemptive action. Still, history records dozens of slave ship rebellions. A ship's journal from June of 1770 off the coast of West Africa documents a series of revolt attempts within 1 month. It goes as follows. 6th of June, 1770. The slaves made an insurrection, which was soon quelled, with the loss of 2 women. 23rd of June. Died a girl slave, number 13. The slaves attempted an insurrection, lost a man of Captain Montpenny's purchase, who jumped overboard and was drowned. Employed securing the men in chains, and gave the women concerned 24 lashes each. 26th of June. A few of them got off their handcuffs, but were detected in time. 27th of June. The slaves attempted to force up the gratings in the night, with a design to murder the whites or drown themselves. The women as well as the men were determined, if disappointed of cutting off the whites, to jump overboard and burn the ship as a last resort. Their obstinacy put me under necessity of shooting the ringleader. End of the log entries. Well, this all happened in a single voyage. definitely getting more than what they bargained for, trying to keep them all below deck. It shows that the captives persistently resisted and were willing to risk death for a chance at freedom, or at least to get their own back. So when a mutiny erupted, the crew responded with overwhelming force. Sailors used swords, firearms, and whatever means necessary to suppress rebellion. Those Africans who survived a failed revolt faced savage punishment. It was common for ringleaders to be executed on spot, for example by shooting or hanging, with all the other captives being made to watch. Some were thrown alive to the sharks as both punishment and a terror tactic. Others might be tortured or mutilated. There are accounts of crews cutting off the limbs of captured rebel leaders, or forcing the remaining captives to watch as their bodies were dragged behind the ship. These gruesome reprisals were meant to crush any further thought of resistance. Now, ironically, the financial loss from killing slaves in a revolt could be mitigated by insurance. European insurers often covered losses from insurrection or, quote, perils of the sea, effectively reimbursing slave owners for dead captives. In one Dutch insurance policy of 1770, a clause explicitly compensated owners for slaves lost to revolt or thrown overboard. This practice only reinforced the view of enslaved people as expendable. But perhaps the most infamous example of cruelty and calculated murder at sea is the case of the British slave ship Zong in 1781. The Zong was overloaded with slaves, around 440 of them on board, on a voyage from West Africa to Jamaica. Disease and malnutrition began killing captives and crew alike as the ship entered the calm equatorial waters known as the doldrums. Facing a shortage of portable water, Captain Luke Collingwood made a horrific decision. He resolved to jettison some of the cargo and save supplies. And by cargo, he means the slaves. Of course, he would then just claim insurance compensation for the loss. Over several days, in late November 1781, the crew disposed of 132 enslaved Africans, throwing them overboard. These were people deemed too sick to survive, or just too thin to fetch a good price. Another 10 captives, in a final act of defiance, jumped into the sea rather than be cast over. The captain later noted quite cynically that it was a loss due to an act of obstinacy on their part. In total, about 142 Africans were gone. When the Zong reached port in Black River, Jamaica, the ship's owners filed an insurance claim for the value of 132 slaves who had been thrown overboard. The subsequent legal case in England, Gregson versus Gilbert, initially treated the matter as a routine insurance dispute, essentially ruling that a captain could lawfully dispose of cargo in emergencies. It was only after the abolitionist Granville Sharp publicized the case that the British public began to grasp the inhumanity that it laid bare. The Zong massacre epitomizes the utter devaluation of African life in the slave trade. One later depiction of such an atrocity appeared in an American abolitionist newspaper in 1832, showing a captain on a Brazilian slaver having sick Africans thrown overboard to avoid import duties, calmly treating people as disposable commodities. As commentators noted, it was the profit motive taken to a murderous extreme, an attitude that regarded enslaved people as worth more dead via insurance or cost saving than alive in the most certain moments. This simultaneous objectification of people and disdain for their lives allowed many crews to wantonly discard human beings without a hint of remorse. And they did. And so, after weeks, perhaps even months at sea, typically a 6 to 8 week crossing in the 18th century, though sometimes much longer. The survivors of the Middle Passage finally saw land on the horizon. For better or worse, we don't really know. By the time a slave ship approached the Americas, those still alive were often emaciated, dehydrated, and ill. Their ordeal did not end on reaching port, however. The captives would now be prepared for sale, just like any other product arriving in the market. As soon as the ship docked or anchored, the crew got busy bringing the enslaved on deck and began efforts to improve their appearance. They were usually washed with buckets of seawater or taken to shore and bathed. After months in close confinement, many had skin covered with grime, sores, or salt from dried sweat. The crew shaved the men's faces, sometimes their heads, to make them look younger and healthier. Bodies were rubbed with a palm oil or grease to hide blemishes and give the skin a sheen of vitality. If a person had wounds or ulcers, these might be filled with hot tar as a crude cosmetic treatment to cover raw flesh. In some cases, dye was applied to hair to cover any graying, and ruptures, being from hernias or from strain or injury, were trussed up with bandages to prevent any obvious bulges. These preparations were all aimed at fetching the highest possible price at auction. The more marketable the product seemed, the more you could sell it for that higher price. And of course, it was all about getting the highest possible price. And so, like that, all of the slaves, as best as they could, were prepared. On shore, slave traders separated the captives by category. Now, the categories were somewhat as follows. The prime slaves, typically young adult males who looked nice and healthy and strong, were isolated for prominent auction display. Of course, these would be the strongest workers. The slaves were there to do the heavy lifting, so the stronger and taller someone would be, the better slaves they would be for the one who purchases them. As for the women and the adolescent youths, they were grouped, and small children who appeared weak were set aside. Sometimes a doctor or an assessor would examine the captives, poking and prodding to judge their condition, and assigning them arbitrary values. Think about giving them classifications such as first-class slaves and second-class slaves, this kind of thing. And then came the sale itself, often a public auction or a so-called scramble. At auctions, buyers scrutinized the Africans as much as the crew had done back on the coast of Africa, forcing mouths open to check teeth, feeling limbs, and making the enslaved walk or jump to assess their fitness, sometimes making them lift heavy things, a kind of test run of some of the work they would be doing for the customer. Families that had managed to stay together through the voyage were frequently torn apart at this stage, as different buyers bid on individuals, and it was very rare that they would purchase a whole family together. One eyewitness in the Caribbean described children clinging to their mothers when they realized they were about to be sold separately, only to be dragged away by the new owners amidst heart-rending screams. Many newly arrived captives were so weakened that they died soon after arrival. In fact, plantation societies like Brazil and the Caribbean, a significant percentage of imported Africans perished in their first year, a period grimly referred to as the seasoning time. They succumbed to new diseases, which of course they had zero immunity to, things like yellow fever and all the rest, little surprises that the new world had in store for them, or to the compounded effects of malnutrition and the abuses suffered during the Middle Passage. Plantation owners took this high early mortality for granted, viewing the fresh imports as replaceable units that might not all survive long. In North America, where conditions were somewhat less lethal, newly arrived Africans still faced a tremendous adjustment, and often carried lasting scars, physical and psychological, from the voyage. For every individual, the transition from the nightmare at sea to the harsh reality of slavery on land was yet another profound shock. The Middle Passage was over, but the long journey into bondage continued on foreign soil in a foreign world. Pretty horrifying from start to finish, I'm sure you'll agree. Well, to wrap all this up, the experience of the enslaved people aboard the slave ship could be one of the most horrific chapters in history. It's definitely up there. It must be top 5. The Middle Passage subjected millions to extreme overcrowding, violence, disease, and don't forget the psychological terror. Why? To make money. That's all it was. They just wanted to make money. Well, not good at all. We have heard in the words of those who endured it, how the holds of the slave ships became airless, pestilential dungeons, filled with loathsome filth and utter despair. We've seen through ship logs and accounts how captains treated human lives as units of profit, chaining, flogging, and even randomly killing them with impunity. And yet, even in the depths of this floating prison of depravity, enslaved people did their best to resist and assert their humanity, whether through open revolt or simple acts of singing a lament together in the dark. By examining the Middle Passage through all the sources and the first-hand testimony, we avoid sanitizing the past. The facts speak plainly. The slave trade was a human disaster on a vast scale, fueled by greed, maintained by terror. Its broad geographical scope, spanning Africa, the Americas, and Europe, meant that the legacy of this violence is global. Understanding what enslaved people endured on the ships is essential to understanding the history of what's going on with the diaspora and the enduring impact of slavery. Well, unfortunately, there's still plenty of slaves around. We might have banned the practice in the civilized world, but it's still happening in other parts of the world. Hopefully we can bring all that to an end soon. It's largely thanks to the testimony of survivors, though, like Equiano, and even the records of the slave traders themselves, that we can even talk about this grim reality and reconstruct it so many years later. I hope that I've presented a factual and unembellished narrative of that experience. I'll let the brutal realities speak for themselves. The emotional weight of the Middle Passage doesn't come from rhetoric, but it comes from the real cries and sufferings recorded in those historical sources. In bearing witness to their ordeal, even at a remove of centuries, we have to acknowledge the true human cost of the trade, ensure that the victims' experiences are never forgotten. And with that, that's the end of the video for today. Interesting, wasn't it? Now I'm going to thank my top tier patrons and subscribers. That's on YouTube and Patreon, by the way. Doug, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Star Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, and Towery. Thank you so much. Well, what did you think about all this? I hope you enjoyed it. I suppose we can use those words. Perhaps you learned something. Perhaps it was even more horrifying than you thought. But tell me what you think. I can do a little bit more slave history. What I will be doing is a video about the African markets for slaves. Remember, they were selling their own people. We will do some about that, and we will do some video about the Islamic slave trade, which was equally as brutal, and perhaps slavery in some earlier times. We'll be talking a lot more about slavery. That's what I'm trying to say. But for now, we won't be talking much because that is the end of the video. And in a more casual fashion, I'm going to thank you for watching. I'm going to wish you all the best. And as always, lots of love to you all. Stay safe, everybody. Be good to each other out there. And good night.